December 8th, 1888. Ouray, Colorado. An entire town is mobilizing to save a dying child. Women cooking in shifts, men organizing search parties, a Chinese herbalist mixing tonics, miners abandoning their work, all for a little girl no one can identify. A child who appeared from nowhere weeks ago and is now slipping away despite everything they've done to save her. To understand why this rough mining town is fighting so desperately for one mysterious child, we need to go back. Back to an October morning when 7 miners found something impossible in the wilderness. To understand what happened that October, you need to understand Ouray in 1888. Just 13 years old as an incorporated town, Ouray was exploding. The Virginius mine, the Revenue mine, and the Bachelor, these weren't just holes in the ground. They were empires of silver, pulling desperate men from across the country into these unforgiving peaks. The town sat at 7,800 feet, cradled in a natural amphitheater of mountains that rose another 6,000 feet on all sides. Above the mines, beyond where even the most aggressive claim stakers ventured, stretched wilderness so thick and wild that settlers spoke of it in whispers. The Uncompahgre National Forest, endless, ancient, and absolutely indifferent to human survival. On October 12, 1888, a crew of 7 men from the Mountain Queen mine finished their graveyard shift just before dawn. These weren't greenhorns. James Kirkland, the crew foreman, had been mining these mountains for 11 years. He was known throughout Ouray as a hard man. Fair, but hard. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't waste words. He'd buried 2 partners in cave-ins and kept working. He'd lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite one winter and was back in the mines within a week. The other miners respected him, but no one would call him warm. Thomas Chen, one of the few Chinese miners who'd stayed after the Exclusion Act, knew every game trail for 20 miles. Wilhelm Strauss, a German immigrant, could read weather in the aspens like some men read books. They'd worked through the night, following a promising vein deep into the mountain. Now, as the first gray light touched the peaks, they began the 4-mile trek back to Ouray. But Chen, ever the hunter, suggested they take the high route through Cascade Creek Basin. There'd been elk sign up there, and they were all hungry for fresh meat. It was a decision that would change 7 lives forever. According to Kirkland's later testimony to the county sheriff, they'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes, moving through old-growth spruce and fir that blocked out most of the rising sun. The forest was cathedral quiet. Too quiet, Chen would later say, the kind of silence that makes the back of your neck prickle. Then they heard it, a sound that made them stop dead in their tracks. What they heard they would each describe differently. Kirkland said it was crying, but not exactly. Strauss said it sounded like wind through a hollow log, but with rhythm, with intention. Chen, who'd grown up hearing mountain spirits in his grandfather's stories, said later he knew immediately that something was wrong. Not dangerous, necessarily, but wrong. The sound was coming from somewhere off the trail, past a section of fallen timber. They debated whether it might be a cougar. The big cats could sound almost human sometimes, but Chen insisted it wasn't. Something in his voice made them trust his instinct. They moved slowly, pushing aside branches, their lanterns cutting through the morning gloom. They found her 30 yards off the trail, in a small clearing where an ancient spruce had fallen years before. At first, Kirkland would later write in his journal, he thought it was a bundle of old clothes caught in the brambles. Then the bundle moved. It was a child, a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, dressed in a filthy nightgown that might once have been white. Her dark hair was matted with pine needles and mud. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Her face was scratched, but it was her eyes that struck them silent, wide open, staring at nothing, unblinking in the growing light. She was curled beneath the massive root system of the fallen tree, and she was making that sound they'd heard. That strange, rhythmic moaning that was half cry, half song. Kirkland knelt slowly and spoke to her, asking if she could hear him, telling her they were there to help. His voice was rough, uncomfortable with gentleness. The child didn't respond, didn't react when he gently touched her shoulder. She just kept staring at the trees above her, making that haunting sound. One of the men asked if she was even alive. She was breathing. They could see her chest rising and falling, but there was something absent about her, something hollow. Here's what made it impossible, what turned 7 practical, hard-headed miners into frightened, superstitious men. They were more than 8 miles from Ouray, 6 miles from the nearest mining camp. The terrain they'd just crossed, terrain they knew intimately, was brutal even for grown men with proper boots and supplies, dense underbrush, steep ravines, places where you had to use both hands to climb. The overnight temperature had dropped to 28 degrees. There had been freezing rain. They'd seen black bear sign on the trail that morning. Mountain lions hunted these woods, and this child, barefoot, wearing nothing but a thin nightgown, had somehow survived. Not just survived. According to what they could piece together from the disturbed ground around the tree, she'd been there at least 1 night, possibly 2. The men stood there in the gray morning light, looking at this impossible thing they'd found. One of them said what they were all thinking. This isn't possible. A child can't survive out here like this, not dressed like that. But she had. The question was how, and where had she come from? Chen suggested quietly that maybe they shouldn't ask these questions. Maybe they should just take her down to town and let the doctor decide. There was something in his voice, an old fear, something from the stories his grandfather used to tell, that made the others nervous. They agreed. She needed help. They could figure out the rest later. Kirkland removed his coat, his only coat, the one that kept him alive in the deep mines, and wrapped it around the child without hesitation. She didn't resist, but she didn't help either. It was like wrapping a wooden doll. When he lifted her into his arms, he would later tell his wife that she weighed almost nothing, that she was cold as river stone. "We're taking you down," he said, his voice gruff. "You're safe now." If he noticed the irony in that statement, that she'd somehow been safer alone in the wilderness than any child had a right to be, he didn't mention it. And as he carried her down the mountain toward Ouray, with his 6 companions walking in silence around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd found something they weren't meant to find. They reached Ouray just after 9 in the morning on October 12th. By 9:30, the entire town knew. By noon, there were 3 different stories spreading through the saloons and boarding houses, each one more unsettling than the last. Dr. Marcus Holliday, Ouray's only physician, examined the child in his office on Main Street while a crowd gathered outside. His notes from that examination still exist in the Ouray County Historical Society archives. What he wrote raises more questions than it answers. The child was female, approximate age 4 to 6 years. She was severely underweight at about 35 pounds. She had extensive abrasions to her feet consistent with barefoot travel over rough terrain. Scratches and contusions covered her face, arms, and legs. She showed mild hypothermia and dehydration. But then Dr. Holliday noted something that puzzled him deeply. The child showed no signs of severe frostbite despite the reported overnight exposure. No infection in her wounds despite them being open for an estimated 24 to 48 hours. Most puzzling of all, the child was unresponsive to verbal or physical stimuli but appeared alert. Her eyes tracked movement but showed no recognition, no fear, no emotion whatsoever. He wrote in his notes, "It is as if the child is present in body but absent in mind." I have seen this type of dissociation in adults who have suffered severe trauma, but never in one so young, and never to this degree. She does not cry. She does not speak. She makes only that constant, low sound that her rescuers described. When I tested her reflexes, they were normal. When I held food before her, she did not reach for it. When I brought a lantern close to her eyes, her pupils contracted appropriately, but she showed no discomfort or aversion. She simply stared. Dr. Holliday did what he could. He cleaned and dressed her wounds, wrapped her in warm blankets, tried to get her to drink water. She wouldn't drink on her own, but she didn't resist when he carefully tipped liquid into her mouth. She swallowed reflexively. The same with food. He had to place it in her mouth, but once there she would chew and swallow. It was like caring for a breathing statue. While the doctor worked, Sheriff Thomas McKinney began asking questions. The obvious first question, had anyone in Ouray reported a missing child? The answer was no. In a town of barely 2,000 people, everyone knew everyone. There were perhaps 40 children under the age of 10 in the entire valley. None were missing. The sheriff sent riders to the neighboring settlements, Ridgeway, Telluride, Silverton. No reports of missing children there either. He sent telegrams to Montrose, to Durango, even to Grand Junction. Nothing. It was as if the child had materialized out of thin air. But while the official investigation began, something else was happening in Ouray, something that would define the next 3 months. The town was adopting this child. Within hours of her arrival, the general store owner brought clothing, small dresses, shoes, warm stockings. The hotel cook sent soup and bread. The school teacher, Miss Sarah Brennan, arrived with books and a small stuffed rabbit. The blacksmith's wife brought blankets she'd been saving for her own grandchild. No one knew who this child was. No one knew if they'd ever find her family. But she was here, she was hurt, and she was alone. That was enough. Dr. Holliday had to turn people away from his office that first day. Everyone in town wanted to help, wanted to see her, wanted to be part of whatever came next. The doctor finally posted a notice on his door. The child needed rest and quiet. Donations could be left with his wife, Catherine. Visitors would be allowed once the child had recovered somewhat. That evening, the town council held an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to establish a fund for the child's care. Every merchant, mine owner, and saloon keeper contributed. Sarah Carver, the schoolteacher from nearby Silverton, collected donations from nearly everyone in town. The Chinese community donated money and offered traditional herbal remedies. Even the dance hall girls pooled their tips. By the end of the first week, there was enough money to care for the child for a year or more. Even a pair of British miners passing through town, brothers named Whitley, who'd been working claims in the high country, stopped by to inquire about the girl's condition. They seemed particularly interested, asking detailed questions about where exactly she'd been found and what she'd been wearing. Dr. Holliday found their concern touching, though he couldn't help but notice something odd in their expressions when they saw her. Recognition? Guilt? Before he could ask, they'd tipped their hats and moved on, saying they had business in Telluride. They were never seen in Ouray again. Then there was the nightgown. Dr. Holliday noted that it was made of fine cotton, with delicate stitching along the collar and cuffs. This wasn't a garment worn by mining families or homesteaders. This was something a wealthy family would dress their child in. But there were no wealthy families in this part of Colorado, not living out here in the mountains anyway. The mine owners and investors lived in Denver or San Francisco, visiting their operations only occasionally. The nightgown also bore a small embroidered monogram on the chest, just visible beneath the layers of dirt and blood. The letters were E.R. Sheriff McKinney began checking every family in the county with those initials. He checked property records, mining claims, hotel registries. He found an Edward Rollins who owned shares in the Virginius mine, but Rollins lived in Chicago and hadn't visited Ouray in 3 years. His family had never been to Colorado at all. The investigation went nowhere. Meanwhile, the child remained in Dr. Holliday's care. He set up a cot for her in the back room of his office, and his wife, Catherine, took over most of the child's care. Catherine was a patient woman, a former schoolteacher, and she tried everything she could think of to reach the girl. She sang to her, read to her, showed her toys and dolls, brought in other children, thinking that might spark some recognition or response. Nothing worked. The child would sit where she was placed, stare at nothing, and make that sound. That endless, haunting sound that Catherine later described as the loneliest noise I've ever heard. On the third day, something changed. Catherine had brought the child outside into the small garden behind the doctor's office. It was a beautiful October afternoon, the aspens turning gold against the deep blue sky. She'd seated the child on a bench and was hanging laundry when she realized the sound had stopped. She turned, frightened that something had happened. But the child was simply staring up at the mountains. For the first time since she'd been found, her expression had changed. There was something there now. Not quite recognition, but yearning. A terrible, aching sadness that was somehow worse than the blank emptiness that had been there before. Then the child spoke. Her voice was hoarse from disuse and from making that sound for days on end, but the word was clear. Home. That's all she said, just that one word. Then her face went blank again, and the sound resumed. Catherine ran to get her husband and the sheriff. By the time they returned, the child had retreated back into whatever place she'd been before. They tried to get her to speak again, asked her where home was, what her name was, who her parents were. nothing, just that blank stare and that awful sound. But now they knew she could speak, which meant that wherever she'd come from, whoever she'd been before, some part of that person was still in there. The question was whether anyone could reach her. Word of the mysterious child spread beyond Ouray. Newspapers picked up the story. The Denver Post ran a front-page article, "Ghost Child Found in San Juan's, Origin Unknown." The Rocky Mountain News sent a reporter to Ouray to investigate. Harper's Weekly published a sensationalized account, complete with illustrations that bore little resemblance to the actual events. With the publicity came theories. So many theories. And with the theories came people. Some said she must have been part of a wagon train that had been attacked by renegade Utes. But the last major Indian conflicts in the area had been years earlier, and there were no reports of attacks or missing settlers. Others suggested she'd been kidnapped by someone who had then abandoned her in the forest. But why? And who would take a child so far into such brutal terrain only to leave her alive? The more superstitious locals had darker explanations. Old stories about changelings, fairy children left in place of human babies. Or the girl was a spirit of the forest, something that only looked like a child but wasn't really human at all. After all, how else could you explain her survival? The town held a meeting at the schoolhouse to address the theories and rumors. Sheriff McKinney stood before a packed room and laid out what they knew, what they didn't know, and what they needed to focus on: finding her family and helping her heal. The speculation wasn't helping anyone, least of all the child. "This is a little girl," he said firmly. "Not a ghost, not a fairy tale. She's hurt, and she's lost, and she's in our care now. We can debate how she survived later. Right now, we focus on making sure she keeps surviving." The room erupted in applause. That was Ouray. Practical, determined, focused on what needed doing rather than what couldn't be explained. Thomas Chen, who'd been one of the miners who found her, stood up and addressed the crowd. He told anyone who would listen that they should never have brought her down from the mountain, that some things were meant to stay lost. But even as he said it, his eyes were wet. He'd contributed to her care fund like everyone else. He brought her berries and sat with her, even though it frightened him. Because she was here, and she needed help, and that's what you did. 2 weeks after the discovery, a woman arrived in Ouray from Leadville. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and she'd read about the child in the newspaper. She came to Dr. Holliday's office, claiming the girl was her daughter, Emily, who had disappeared 6 months earlier. Sheriff McKinney was skeptical, but hopeful. He brought Mrs. Whitmore to see the child. The moment Eleanor Whitmore saw the girl, she began weeping. She was certain this was her Emily. She dropped to her knees before the child and spoke her name, called her "my darling girl," begged her to recognize her mother. She pointed out a small birthmark on the child's wrist, insisted the shape of her face was identical, that she knew her own daughter. The child stared through her as if she weren't there. Dr. Holliday and Catherine exchanged glances. The ages were different. The hair color was different. But grief does strange things to a person's mind, and Eleanor Whitmore was clearly a woman drowning in it. Mrs. Whitmore stayed in Ouray for 3 days, spending hours with the child, trying desperately to reach her. She brought a doll from home, her Emily's favorite, she said, sang lullabies, told stories about their life together in Leadville. The child never responded, never showed the slightest hint of recognition. On the 3rd day, Dr. Holliday gently took Mrs. Whitmore aside. He'd been making inquiries by telegraph. Emily Whitmore had indeed disappeared from Leadville 6 months ago, but Emily Whitmore was 7 years old and had blonde hair, significantly different from the dark-haired child in their care. Furthermore, Emily's body had been found 2 months after her disappearance, drowned in the Arkansas River. Eleanor Whitmore had never accepted her daughter's death. In her grief, she'd convinced herself that every young girl she saw might be Emily, regardless of how little they actually resembled her. Dr. Holliday arranged for her to return to Leadville with a traveling minister and his wife, who promised to see her safely back to her family. After that, Sheriff McKinney was more careful about investigating claims. There were others. 2 more women came forward in the following weeks, both convinced the child was theirs. Neither claim held up to scrutiny. The child remained nameless, remained unreachable, and remained utterly mysterious. But she wasn't alone. Catherine Holliday made sure of that. She invited the townswomen to visit, hoping that different faces, different voices might reach the girl where she couldn't. They came in shifts, the school teacher reading stories, the minister's wife singing hymns, the Chinese laundry women teaching simple hand games. The children of Ouray were especially persistent. They'd appear at the holiday house asking if Emma could come play. Catherine would bring the girl out to the porch where the children would try to include her in their games. She wouldn't participate, but she'd watch, those empty eyes following their movements. And maybe, just maybe, there was something there. Some flicker of response that gave everyone hope. The miners who'd found her checked in regularly, though most came only once or twice before the strangeness of it drove them away. But James Kirkland came every day, every single day, without fail. He'd finish his shift at the Mountain Queen, wash up at the boarding house, and walk to the holiday residence. He never stayed long. 15 minutes, maybe 20. He'd sit in the chair beside her bed or on the porch step near where she sat. He didn't try to make her talk or play. He just sat there, this hard-faced man with his scarred hands and his missing fingers, and he'd tell her about his day. He'd describe the mine, the way the silver vein caught the lamplight, the sound of picks on stone. He'd talk about the mountains, the weather, the aspens turning gold, simple things, ordinary things. His voice was rough, uncomfortable with the whole business, but he kept coming back. Catherine Holliday watched this with a mixture of surprise and tenderness. Everyone in town knew James Kirkland, respected him, but no one would have called him soft. He'd never remarried after his wife died in childbirth 7 years ago, had no children of his own, kept to himself. And here he was, sitting with this strange, lost child every day like it was his job. One evening, Catherine asked him why he came so faithfully. Kirkland was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I carried her down. That means something." That was all he'd say about it. But Catherine noticed things. The way his jaw tightened when the child made that awful sound. The way his hands would curl into fists when she stared at nothing, unreachable. The way he'd linger an extra moment before leaving, as if hoping this would be the day she'd acknowledge his presence. Chen brought berries when they were in season. Strauss would awkwardly pat the child's hand. They cared, in their way. But Kirkland was different. He'd taken ownership of her survival in a way that no one, including himself, seemed to understand. As October turned to November, the first real snows began to fall in the high country. The mining season was ending, and men began leaving Ouray for the winter, heading to lower elevations where they could find work or wait out the cold months. The story of the lost child began to fade from the newspapers, replaced by other sensations and scandals. But in Ouray itself, the child had become part of the community. Dr. Holliday and his wife had essentially adopted her for the time being, though no formal arrangement could be made since no one knew who she was or where she'd come from. The town had accepted this. The Hollidays were caring for her, and the community supported them in every way possible. Catherine Holliday dressed her in the clothes the townspeople had donated. She taught her, or tried to teach her, how to feed herself, how to use the privy, how to do simple tasks. Women from town took turns visiting, helping with the child's care, sitting with her so Catherine could rest. The girl would comply when guided physically through actions, but she never initiated anything on her own. She was like a wind-up toy that would move when prompted, but otherwise remain perfectly still. She did learn to eat on her own, eventually. She would sleep when put to bed, wake when the sun rose. She would walk when led by the hand. Small improvements that gave everyone hope. But she never spoke again after that one word, home, in the garden, and she never stopped making that sound. Sometimes it was quiet, barely audible. Other times, particularly at night, it would grow louder. Catherine Holliday said it was worse during storms, when the wind howled through the mountain passes. The child would stand at the window, staring out at the darkness, and that sound would rise until it seemed to fill the entire house. The doctor tried everything he could think of. He consulted medical journals, wrote to colleagues in Denver and back east. He read about cases of traumatic shock, of selective mutism, of various disorders of the mind. Nothing quite fit. Nothing explained the child's particular constellation of symptoms. In December, a traveling photographer came through Ouray. His name was Silas Morton, and he specialized in portraits. He'd heard about the mysterious child and asked permission to photograph her. Dr. Holliday agreed, thinking that perhaps distributing the image might help identify her. Morton set up his equipment in the doctor's parlor. He positioned the child carefully, tried to get her to look at the camera. But her eyes, as always, seemed to be looking at something no one else could see, something far away. Morton took 3 photographs that afternoon. He made multiple prints from the best negative, distributing copies to newspapers and law enforcement. One of those prints would eventually hang in the Ouray County Historical Museum. If you ever get the chance to see it, you'll understand why the people of Ouray in 1888 began to think of the child as something other than human. In the photograph, she's seated in a wooden chair, wearing a dark dress that Catherine Holliday had made for her. Her hands are folded in her lap. Her posture is perfect, almost unnaturally straight, but it's her face that stops you. She looks ancient. Not physically. She's clearly a young child. But there's something in her expression, or perhaps in the absence of expression, that suggests something far older than her years. Her eyes are wide and dark and contain nothing, no spark of childhood, no fear or curiosity or joy, just a vast, terrible emptiness. Several newspapers published the photograph with appeals for information. It ran in papers from San Francisco to Chicago to New York. Hundreds of people claimed to recognize her. None of the claims led anywhere. Then, in late November, the child began to fail. It started slowly. She ate less, then less still. Within a week, she was refusing food entirely. Dr. Holliday tried everything: soft foods, broths, sweets that children loved. Nothing worked. She would turn her head away or let the food sit in her mouth without swallowing. She was already thin. She couldn't afford to lose more weight. By the first week of December, she was dying. Everyone could see it. The child was fading like a photograph left in the sun. Her skin became translucent, her breathing shallow. That sound she made grew weaker, more desperate. Dr. Holliday sat by her bedside day and night, trying anything he could think of. Catherine wept openly, begging the child to eat, to fight, to stay, but it was as if the girl had made some decision that no one else could understand or influence. Word spread through town. The child who had survived the impossible was dying in a warm bed with people who loved her. James Kirkland stopped going to the mine. He'd never missed a day's work in 11 years. Not when he'd lost his fingers. Not when he'd had pneumonia so bad he was coughing blood. But now he sat in the Holiday parlor from dawn until well past dark, watching the child slip away. He didn't eat, barely slept, just sat there with his hands clenched, his face like stone. On December 7th, after the child had refused food for 5 days straight, Dr. Holliday found Kirkland in the small room they'd set up for the girl. It was late, past midnight. The doctor had been dozing in his study and woke to a sound. At first, he thought it was the child, that awful moaning sound she made, but it was coming from the wrong direction. He walked down the hall and stopped in the doorway. James Kirkland was kneeling beside the child's bed, his head down, his shoulders shaking. He was crying, not quiet tears, but great, wrenching sobs that seemed to be tearing him apart. His scarred hands gripped the edge of the mattress like he was holding on to the only solid thing in the world. "Please," he was saying, his voice broken and raw, "please don't go. I carried you down. I carried you down from that mountain, and you were so cold, and I thought if I could just get you down to town, get you warm, get you safe." His voice cracked. "Please, I got you out of there. I saved you. You can't die now. Not now. Not after everything." Dr. Holliday stood frozen in the doorway. He'd known James Kirkland for 8 years, had treated him for injuries, had meals with him occasionally at the hotel. He'd always thought of the man as made of iron, unmovable, unbreakable, but here he was, shattered completely. "She's just a child," Kirkland choked out, not knowing anyone was listening. "She's just a little girl, and she shouldn't have been out there, and I don't know what happened to her or where she came from, but I got her out. I got her out, and she's supposed to be safe now. She's supposed to be safe." He pressed his forehead against the mattress, his whole body shaking. "I don't have anybody. My wife's gone. My baby girl's gone. They're both gone, and I couldn't save them. But I saved you. I carried you down and you were alive, and I thought—" He couldn't finish, just kept crying. This hard man broken by a child who'd never even looked at him, never acknowledged his existence. Dr. Holliday quietly backed away and returned to his study. He didn't mention what he'd seen. Some things were too private, too raw, but the next morning, when he told Catherine that they needed to do more, that they couldn't give up, that they had to find something that would reach this child, his voice was fierce in a way she'd never heard before. "James Kirkland is in there dying right alongside her," he said, "and I'll be damned if I let either of them go without a fight." The community refused to accept it. On December 8th, the women of Ouray organized themselves. If the child wouldn't eat regular food, they'd find something she would eat. They brought everything they could think of: milk fresh from the cow, honey, eggs beaten with cream, broth made from elk, bread so fresh it was still warm. They took turns at her bedside, trying each one, coaxing, pleading. The miners came too, awkward and worried. They'd found her. They felt responsible. Kirkland was there constantly now, hollow-eyed and desperate. Chen brought ginger root and made a tea his mother had given him as a child. Strauss sat by her bed and sang German lullabies in his rough voice. The Chinese community sent their herbalist, an elderly man named Lin, who'd been treating ailments in the mining camps for 30 years. He examined the child with gentle hands and prepared tonics from his carefully hoarded stores. He showed Catherine how to massage certain points on the child's hands and feet, techniques passed down through generations. The Ute woman who sold beadwork in town, she was called Mary, though that wasn't her real name, came to the Holiday house and asked to see the child. Catherine, desperate, allowed it. Mary sat with the girl for a long time in silence. Then she began to sing. Not in English, but in her own language. Old songs, songs about mountains and spirits and the spaces between worlds. For the first time in days, the child's eyes focused. Just for a moment. Just enough to give everyone hope. The school teacher, Sarah Brennan, organized the town's children. They made cards and drawings for the sick girl. They sang Christmas carols outside the Holiday house, their young voices rising in the cold December air, a chorus of hope from children for a child. And slowly, impossibly slowly, something changed. The child began to accept small amounts of food again, just a spoonful at first, then another. She was still weak, still distant, but she was no longer fading. The crisis passed. On December 15th, Dr. Holliday emerged from his house for the first time in a week and announced to the crowd gathered outside that the child would live. The relief was palpable. People wept openly. Men shook hands. Women embraced. James Kirkland walked out of the house behind the doctor. He didn't say anything, didn't join the celebration. He just stood there on the porch in the cold December air, and for the first time in a week, his face wasn't stone. It was devastated relief. The look of a man who'd been to the edge of something terrible and somehow stepped back. Catherine Holliday came out and put her hand on his arm. "She's going to be all right, James. You did it. You brought her down from that mountain, and you kept her here." Kirkland's jaw worked. He nodded once, sharp. Then he turned and walked away, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He went back to the mine the next day, went back to his routine, but he still came to visit the child every evening, still sat with her, telling her about his day in that rough, uncomfortable voice. That night, the saloons and dance halls were packed. Everyone was buying rounds, celebrating. They'd done it. The whole town, working together, had pulled this impossible child back from death's door. They'd saved her. Catherine Holliday, exhausted but happy, tucked the child into bed that night. The girl looked better. Still thin, still strange, but alive, growing stronger. For the first time since the child had arrived, Catherine let herself believe that everything would be all right, that they'd get through this mystery together, that one day the girl might even speak again, might tell them who she was and where she'd come from. She kissed the child's forehead and whispered, "We're not giving up on you, Emma. We won't let you go." The child stared at the ceiling, making that soft sound, and Catherine chose to believe it sounded peaceful. A month later, she would remember those words with bitter irony. James Kirkland would remember them too, and for the rest of his life, he would wonder if somehow the child had heard them, if she'd understood that they were holding on too tight, if that's why she'd left. The winter of 1888 was harsh in the San Juans. Snow fell early and heavy, cutting Ouray off from the outside world for weeks at a time. The mines shut down. The town settled into its hibernation, waiting for spring, and the child remained. She'd been with the Holidays for 3 months now. Catherine had grown attached to her despite, or perhaps because of, the girl's strange affliction. She'd started calling her Emma, after her own mother. It wasn't the child's real name, of course, but she needed to be called something. Dr. Holliday was less sanguine about the situation. The child wasn't getting better. If anything, she seemed to be fading in a different way. She ate less. She was losing weight again, though they'd managed to put some back on her after the December crisis. And that sound, it was becoming more constant, more urgent, as if she were trying to communicate something but couldn't quite break through. On the night of January 15, 1889, 3 months to the day after the child had been found, something happened. A blizzard had blown in that afternoon, the kind of storm that made the whole world disappear into white. The temperature had dropped to well below zero. The wind was shrieking through the streets of Ouray, rattling windows, tearing at shutters. The Holidays had gone to bed early, the child tucked into her small bed in the room next to theirs. Catherine had checked on her before retiring. The girl was lying still as always, eyes open, making that soft sound. Dr. Holliday woke just after midnight. Later, he couldn't say what had woken him. The storm, perhaps, or maybe just instinct, but he found himself suddenly wide awake, listening. The house was quiet, too quiet. The child's sound, which had become such a constant presence that you almost stopped hearing it, was gone. He rose and went to her room. The bed was empty. The window was open. The window that had been latched from the inside was now standing wide, snow blowing in, the curtains whipping in the wind. And the child was gone. The town's response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 20 minutes of Dr. Holliday raising the alarm, bells were ringing throughout Ouray, the alarm that meant everyone was needed. Despite the blizzard, despite the hour, despite the killing cold, people came. James Kirkland was there within minutes, still pulling on his coat as he ran through the streets. When he saw the open window, the empty bed, something broke in his face. "No," he said. "Just that. No." They organized themselves with the efficiency of people who'd lived hard lives in hard country. Groups were assigned sections of town. Every building would be checked. Some men went door to door, waking families, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything. They searched through the night. Every building in Ouray, every possible hiding place. They found nothing. At first light, when the search expanded to the outskirts, Thomas Chen found the tracks. Small footprints, bare feet, leading from beneath the window. He shouted for the others, his voice carrying sharp in the cold air. Kirkland got there first. He stood over those tracks, staring down at them. His face was white. His hands were shaking. "She went back," he said, his voice hollow. "She's going back to the mountain." The tracks led up, toward the mountains, toward Cascade Creek Basin, toward the place where they'd found her 3 months ago. "I'm going after her," Kirkland said. His voice was flat, final. "I brought her down. I'm bringing her back." Sheriff McKinney organized a search party, 20 of the strongest men, experienced mountaineers, with proper equipment. But Kirkland was already moving, following those impossible tracks with single-minded determination. For 2 hours, they pushed forward through brutal terrain. The tracks showed no signs of stumbling or falling. They were evenly spaced, purposeful, heading directly up through conditions that should have killed a barefoot child in minutes. The storm was worsening. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The cold was becoming deadly, even for grown men in proper gear. Sheriff McKinney finally grabbed Kirkland's arm. "James, we can't go any further. We'll die up here." "Then go back," Kirkland shouted over the howling wind. "I'm not leaving her. You can't save her if you're dead." "I don't care." The words were torn from him, raw and desperate. "She's out here and I'm not leaving her again." McKinney saw something in Kirkland's face then, something beyond duty or guilt. This hard man, this stoic miner who'd buried his wife without tears, he was breaking apart. "James," McKinney said more gently, "the storm's too much." We come back at first light when it's safe. That's the only way." "She'll be gone by first light," Kirkland said, his voice cracking. "She's barefoot. In this cold, she won't survive." "Then she's already gone," McKinney said, hating himself for saying it. "And you dying up here won't change that. We go back. That's an order." The men turned back, defeated, moving slowly down through the storm, each one knowing what they were leaving behind. Kirkland walked at the back of the group, silent, his face like stone. But when they reached a bend in the trail where the blowing snow obscured visibility, he simply stopped walking. The group continued on without him, not noticing in the whiteout conditions that they were one man short. James Kirkland turned around and started climbing back up the mountain. He moved alone through the storm, following where the tracks had been, trusting his knowledge of these mountains, his instincts, his desperate hope. The wind battered him. The cold bit through his clothes. He could barely see 3 feet ahead. But he kept going. He'd carried her down from this mountain once. He'd sat with her every day for 3 months. He'd almost lost her in December and had been there when she came back. She was his. Maybe she'd never known it. Maybe she'd never seen him at all. But she was his, and he wasn't leaving her. The climb took hours. Kirkland lost all sense of time. His hands were numb. His face was frozen. His lungs burned with every breath of the knife-cold air. But he pushed forward, driven by something beyond reason, beyond survival instinct. He found her just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the storm. She was in the clearing where they'd discovered her 3 months earlier. The same fallen spruce, the same shelter of roots, and beneath those roots, curled in the exact same position as before, was the child. Kirkland dropped to his knees beside her. She was unconscious, her skin gray with cold, her breathing so shallow it was almost invisible. But she was alive. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to leave." He stripped off his coat, his only protection against the cold, and wrapped her in it. "Do you hear me? You don't get to leave." He pulled her against his chest, trying to give her his warmth. "I've got you," he whispered. "I've got you, and I'm taking you home." Then James Kirkland stood with the child in his arms and started the long climb down. He talked to her the whole way, his voice hoarse, desperate, but steady. "Stay with me. Stay with me. I carried you down once before, and you were so cold, but you lived. You lived. So you're going to live now, too. You hear me? You're going to live because I'm not giving up. I'm never giving up on you." The storm was breaking now, visibility improving. The descent that should have killed him, exhausted, frozen, carrying extra weight, somehow didn't. He moved with the sure-footedness of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He was 6 miles from Ouray when the first search party found him. They saw him coming down the mountain through the lifting storm, a lone figure, moving slowly but steadily, something cradled in his arms. At first, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Is that—" someone started. "It's Kirkland," Chen shouted. "And he's got her. He's got the child." The men ran toward him. When they got close enough to see his face, they stopped dead. Kirkland's face was frostbitten, his lips blue, ice in his beard. But his eyes were fierce, burning with an intensity that made them all step back. "She's alive," he said through frozen lips. "Get me to the doctor. Now." They surrounded him, trying to help, but Kirkland wouldn't let anyone take the child from his arms. He just kept walking, holding her against his chest, one foot in front of the other. The word spread through Ouray like wildfire. "Kirkland found her. He's bringing her back." By the time he reached Main Street, the entire town had turned out. People lined the street in stunned silence, watching this impossible thing. James Kirkland, more dead than alive, carrying the child who should have been dead, walking through town like a man carrying the most precious thing in the world. Dr. Holliday met him at his front door. "James, let me take her." "Not yet," Kirkland said. His voice was barely audible. "Not until she's inside. Not until she's safe." He carried her into the house, down the hall, and laid her gently on the bed in her room. Only then did he step back. Only then did his legs give out and he collapsed into a chair. Dr. Holliday worked quickly, efficiently. The child was severely hypothermic, her pulse barely detectable, but she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. Kirkland sat in that chair and refused to move. His own frostbite needed treatment, his exhaustion was life-threatening, but he wouldn't leave. Catherine brought him hot coffee, wrapped blankets around him, but his eyes never left the child. "You should rest, James," she said gently. "No." His voice was firm despite his exhaustion. "Not until I know she's going to be all right." Dr. Holliday worked through the morning. Slowly, gradually, the child's color improved. Her breathing deepened. Her pulse strengthened. And then, as the winter sun climbed higher in the sky, her eyes opened. For the first time since she'd been found 3 months ago, those eyes focused, really focused, on him, on James Kirkland's worn, frozen, desperate face, and she squeezed his hand. It was the smallest pressure, barely noticeable, but Kirkland felt it like an electric shock. His eyes filled with tears. "Emma," he whispered. The child's lips moved. She was trying to speak. Kirkland leaned closer. "You came." The word was barely audible, scratched and broken. "You came back." "I came back," Kirkland said, his voice thick. "I'll always come back. Always." Something shifted in her expression. That terrible emptiness that had haunted her eyes for 3 months began to fade, and for the first time the child looked at him and saw him, really saw him. "Cold," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart. I know, but you're safe now. You're safe, and I've got you." The child's hand tightened in his, just slightly, just enough. "Don't let go. Never," Kirkland said fiercely, his tears falling freely now. "I will never let go." Dr. Holliday stood frozen in the doorway, watching this exchange with his own eyes wet. Catherine was beside him, her hand over her mouth, witnessing something impossible, something miraculous. The child was coming back. It was an instant. Recovery never is. But over the following days and weeks, the change was unmistakable. The child, who had been unreachable for 3 months, was waking up. She started responding to her name, Emma, because that's what everyone called her now. She made eye contact, held it. She smiled, tentatively at first, then more freely. She cried when she was frightened, laughed when something delighted her. She showed emotion. She showed life. And James Kirkland was there for all of it. He'd moved into the Hollidays' spare room so he could be close. He was the first person she saw every morning and the last person she saw every night. He read to her, his rough voice stumbling over words he'd never spoken aloud before. He played simple games with her. He sat with her through nightmares, holding her when she woke terrified, telling her over and over that she was safe. The town watched this transformation with wonder. Hard, stoic James Kirkland, who hadn't smiled in 7 years, who'd buried his wife without shedding a tear, this man was tender with Emma, patient, loving. One evening in early February, Emma spoke a complete sentence for the first time. Kirkland was sitting beside her bed, reading from a book of fairy tales Catherine had provided. Emma had been watching him, her dark eyes following his face as he read. Then, suddenly, she reached out and touched his scarred hand. "You saved me," she said clearly, "from the mountain." Kirkland's throat tightened. He had to set the book down. "Yes," he said, "I did." "Why?" The question was so simple, so direct. Kirkland looked at this small girl who had somehow become the center of his entire world, and he told her the truth. "Because you're mine to save," he said. "Because the moment I picked you up in that clearing, you became mine. And I don't leave what's mine behind." Emma considered this seriously. Then she said something that made Kirkland's heart stop. "I want to stay yours." "You are," he said hoarsely. "You are mine. Forever, if you'll have me." Emma smiled then, a real smile, the first one Kirkland had ever seen on her face. "Papa," she said, testing the word. Kirkland had to look away for a moment. When he looked back, his eyes were wet. "Yes, sweetheart." Papa. The weeks passed, and Emma continued to improve. She was walking now, running even, playing with the other children of Ouray, learning to read with Catherine's help, laughing at silly jokes, being, for the first time, a normal little girl. But sometimes, late at night, she would have dreams, fragmented memories that came to her in pieces. "I remember a big house," she told Kirkland one evening, "music playing, people dancing. Mama wore a blue dress with sparkly things on it." Kirkland listened carefully, never pushing, just accepting whatever she offered. "I was on a train once," she said another time. "It was so loud, and it went on forever and ever, through tunnels and over bridges. I saw the ocean," she said once, staring out the window at the mountains. "It was bigger than anything, bigger than the mountains even. The water just kept going and going." These weren't the memories of a child from a Colorado mining town. They were fragments of a different life, a life of wealth and travel, of fine things and distant places. But Emma never remembered how she'd gotten from that life to this one. Never remembered the journey that had brought her to a clearing in the San Juan Mountains, alone and lost and impossible. Kirkland didn't press. Whatever had happened, it was over now. She was here. She was his. That was all that mattered. In March, Kirkland formally petitioned for guardianship. Sheriff McKinney helped with the legal paperwork. Since no family had come forward in 6 months, and given the extraordinary circumstances, the territorial court granted his request. On March 28, 1889, Emma officially became Emma Kirkland. Kirkland carried the papers home like they were made of gold. That evening, he sat Emma down in the small house he'd prepared for them, adding a bedroom, building furniture with his own scarred hands, making it warm and safe. "This is yours now," he told her, showing her the official documents she was too young to read. "These papers say you're my daughter, that I'm your father, that we're a family." Emma looked at him with those dark eyes that were so full of life now, so different from the empty stare of the 6 months ago. "We were already a family," she said matter-of-factly. "The papers just make it so other people know?" Kirkland pulled her into his arms and held her tight. This child who'd somehow become his entire world. This impossible, miraculous gift that the mountain had given him twice. As the months turned into years, Ouray watched James Kirkland become a different man. The hard edges softened. He smiled more, laughed even. He took shorter shifts at the mine so he could be home when Emma came back from school. He attended town socials and church services, things he'd never done before. Also, Emma could have a normal childhood, a full life. And in the spring of 1891, James Kirkland met Anna Morrison. She was a widow from Silverton, visiting her sister in Ouray. She was kind and quiet, with a gentle smile and a patience that came from her own losses. She'd lost her husband to pneumonia 2 years earlier and had no children of her own. She met Kirkland at a town social. Or rather, she met Emma first and Kirkland second. Emma had been playing with the other children when she'd fallen and scraped her knee. She was crying. Real tears, the kind normal children cried over normal hurts, and Anna had been the one to clean the wound and bandage it. When Kirkland came looking for his daughter, he found her sitting with this strange woman, laughing at a story about a clumsy cat. "Papa," Emma called when she saw him, "this is Miss Anna." She fixed my knee, and she told me the funniest story about her cat that got stuck in a tree, and the fire brigade had to get him down, but he jumped before they could catch him and landed on the fire chief's head. Kirkland looked at this woman who'd made his daughter laugh, and something in his chest loosened. Something he hadn't even known was tight. "Thank you," he said, "for helping her." Anna smiled. "She's a lovely girl. You're very lucky." "I know," Kirkland said simply, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They married 8 months later, in December of 1891. Emma was the flower girl, beaming with pride. The entire town attended, celebrating not just a wedding but the final piece of a miracle falling into place. The Kirklands became a family of 3. Anna took to Emma instantly, and Emma, who'd been calling Kirkland Papa for over a year, started calling Anna Mama within weeks. They were happy, impossibly, miraculously happy. Emma grew into a bright, curious child. She did well in school, She had friends. She was, by all accounts, normal, happy, loved. But she still had those fragmentary memories, pieces of a past that didn't quite fit together. I remember riding on a ship for days and days and days, she told them one evening when she was 8 years old. The floor moved under my feet. Everything smelled like salt. I remember fancy parties, she said another time. Everyone dressed up. I had a dress with ribbons. So many ribbons. I remember. She paused, her face troubled. Shouting. People shouting. Someone crying. Being carried somewhere. It was dark. I was scared. But she could never remember more than fragments, and as the years passed, even those fragments faded, replaced by real memories. Happy memories. Of Ouray. Of her family. Of her life. By 1892, Emma was a thriving 9-year-old. She was learning piano from Sarah Brennan. She helped Anna in the garden. She read voraciously everything she could get her hands on. She was, in every way that mattered, James and Anna Kirkland's daughter. One evening in October of 1892, 4 years to the month after Emma had been found, Kirkland was sitting in his living room reading the newspaper by the fire. Anna was in the kitchen preparing supper. Emma was upstairs doing her schoolwork. Kirkland needed kindling to build up the fire. He reached for the stack of old newspapers he kept in a box beside the fireplace, papers he'd collected from various sources to use as fire starters. Among them were several newspapers that had been left behind weeks earlier by a British gentleman who'd passed through Ouray. The man had been a mining investor from London, visiting various operations in Colorado. He'd stayed at the Grand Imperial Hotel for 3 days, then moved on to Telluride, leaving behind a stack of old London newspapers he'd brought from home. The hotel clerk had offered them to anyone who wanted them. Kirkland had taken them, thinking they'd be useful for starting fires. He'd been working his way through the stack for weeks now, barely glancing at them before tossing them into the flames. This evening, he grabbed a paper dated June 1887, more than 5 years old. He was about to crumple it when something caught his eye. A headline on the 3rd page. Ransford child still missing. Family offers reward. Kirkland almost didn't read it. It was an old story from another country, but something made him smooth out the paper and read the article. The family of Emily Rose Ransford continues their search for the child who disappeared 9 months ago during a bitter custody dispute. Miss Ransford, age 4, was last seen in Portsmouth on the 15th of September, 1886, when she was taken from her governess by an unidentified man. Despite extensive searches and a substantial reward offered by the family, no trace of the child has been found. Lord Ransford and Lady Ransford, heartbroken by the disappearance of their only granddaughter, have not given up hope of her return. The child's parents, Mr. Edmund Ransford and his estranged wife, Mrs. Charlotte Ransford, née Hartley, had been engaged in a contentious custody battle at the time of the child's disappearance. Both parents were questioned extensively by police, but neither was implicated in the kidnapping. The child is described as having dark hair, dark eyes, and was wearing a white nightgown with embroidered initials ER at the time of her disappearance. Anyone with information is asked to contact. The article continued, but Kirkland had stopped reading. His hands were shaking. The newspaper trembled in his grip. Emily Rose Ransford, ER age 4 in 1886. Dark hair, dark eyes, white nightgown with embroidered initials, found in Colorado in October 1888, 2 years after disappearing from England. Emma's fragmentary memories suddenly made terrible sense. The ship, the ocean, the fancy parties, the big house, the shouting, the crying, someone carrying her somewhere dark, a kidnapping gone wrong, a child taken across an ocean, brought to America for reasons no one would ever know. Then, somehow, ending up in the Colorado wilderness, alone and traumatized. The British family had been searching in England while their granddaughter was in Colorado. The American newspapers that had run stories about the mysterious child of Ouray had never made it to London. 2 continents, 2 searches, and no connection ever made. Kirkland looked at the date on the article again, June 1887, then looked at the date of the newspaper itself, published in May 1887, left behind by the British gentleman just weeks ago. He scanned quickly through the stack of other London papers, found 2 more articles about the missing Ransford child. The last one, from September 1888, mentioned that Lord and Lady Ransford had died, one of grief, the other of illness, within months of each other. The parents, Edmund and Charlotte, had apparently reconciled their differences and resumed their search, but the trail had gone completely cold. There were no more articles after that. The story had faded. The family had given up or died. Emily Rose Ransford had become just another missing child, her fate forever unknown. Except she wasn't unknown. She was upstairs right now, practicing her letters. She was Emma Kirkland. She was his daughter. Kirkland sat there, staring at the newspaper, his mind racing. He could write to England, could make inquiries, could try to find out if there were any Ransfords left, if there was anyone who had a claim to Emma. He could, but should he? Emma was happy. Emma was loved. Emma had a family, a home, a future. She had no memory of England, no memory of being Emily Rose Ransford. Whatever trauma she'd experienced, the kidnapping, the journey, the abandonment, had been buried so deep she might never fully remember. What good would it do to drag all that back up? To tell her she was someone else, from somewhere else? To potentially lose her to a family she didn't remember, to a country she'd never known? She was his daughter. Not by blood, not by birth, but by the mountain that had given her to him twice, by the 3 months he'd sat with her when she couldn't see him, by the storm he'd walked through to bring her home, by 4 years of raising her, loving her, being her father. The law might see it differently. The law might say she belonged to the Ransford family, if any of them still lived. But Kirkland knew the truth. Emma belonged to him, and he belonged to her. "Papa?" Kirkland's head snapped up. Emma was standing in the doorway, looking at him with concern. "Are you all right? You look funny." Kirkland realized his face must have shown everything he was feeling. Shock, fear, determination. He schooled his features, forced himself to relax. "I'm fine, honey," he said. His voice was steadier than he felt. "Just reading the news." Emma came closer, curious. "What does it say?" Kirkland looked down at the newspaper in his hands, at the article about Emily Rose Ransford, aged 4, missing since 1886, at the heartbreak of a family that would never know their granddaughter had survived, at the truth that could destroy everything he'd built. He looked at Emma, his daughter, his impossible gift, and made his decision. "Nothing important," he said. He slowly, deliberately crumpled the newspaper into a ball. Just old news from far away. He stood and walked to the fireplace. Emma followed him, watching. Kirkland held the crumpled newspaper over the flames for just a moment. One last moment where he could change his mind, could decide to do the right thing and search for the Ransford family. But Emma was right here. Emma was real. Emma was his. He dropped the newspaper into the fire. They watched together as the flames caught, as the paper blackened and curled, as the words about Emily Rose Ransford disappeared into ash and smoke, as the last connection to a past that no longer mattered was consumed by fire. "What was it about?" Emma asked, watching the paper burn. "A little girl who was lost," Kirkland said. His voice was quiet. "But she was found, and she lived happily ever after." Emma smiled. "I like those kinds of stories." "So do I, sweetheart." Kirkland put his arm around her shoulders. "So do I." They stood there together, father and daughter, watching the fire burn. The truth turned to ash, the past erased, the future secure. Anna called from the kitchen that supper was ready. Emma ran to the table. Kirkland followed, leaving the fireplace behind, leaving the burned newspaper behind, leaving Emily Rose Ransford behind forever. She was Emma Kirkland now. She would always be Emma Kirkland. And nothing, not the truth, not the past, not anything, would ever take her away from him again. That night, as Kirkland tucked Emma into bed, she hugged him tight. "I love you, Papa," she said sleepily. "I love you too, Emma," he said. And he meant it with everything he was. He'd carried her down from a mountain twice. He'd fought death for her. And tonight, he'd fought the truth for her, because she was his daughter, and he was her father. And sometimes the bonds you choose are stronger than the bonds of blood. Sometimes the family you make is the only family that matters. If you enjoyed this story of courage and honor on the frontier, click that subscribe button now. We have dozens more tales of unlikely heroes, dangerous choices, and life-changing decisions waiting for you. Ready for another unforgettable story? Click the video on your screen right now to watch a tale of survival and justice that will stay with you long after it ends. Don't miss it.